The early sun cast a warm, inviting light over Maplewood Glen, a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city. Perfectly manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and rows of prim houses with pastel trim set the stage for what appeared to be an idyllic community. Most of the neighbors politely greeted each other in passing, exchanging superficial pleasantries about the weather or the local farmers market. It was the sort of place that boasted a homeowners association, known simply as the Maplewood Glen HOA, which busied itself with matters like landscaping contracts, uniform fencing, and mailbox regulations. Into this picture-perfect environment stepped the walking paradox that was Paula Farnell, or, as nearly everyone privately referred to her, Karen. Paula was in her mid-50s, her short, meticulously layered hair dyed a shade too dark for her age. She moved to Maplewood Glen 5 years prior and immediately volunteered on several HOA committees. Initially, neighbors appreciated her energy and organizational prowess. Paula never missed a deadline, never forgot a rule. Yet her ambition and rigid adherence to HOA guidelines soon shaded into arrogance and bossiness. One Tuesday morning, a light breeze rustled the leafy oaks lining the streets. Cars trickled out of driveways as residents embarked on their daily commutes. Some walked over to the community bus stop, an unassuming gray bench with a short awning. Recently, the city had installed a temporary ramp there, intended to help disabled or elderly passengers who used walkers, wheelchairs, or had trouble stepping up onto the bus. Among the people waiting that day was Teresa Miles, a middle-aged woman with a cane, recovering from knee surgery. She was thankful for the ramp, which had just been placed a couple of weeks prior. Also in line was her neighbor, Jorge Lopez, who occasionally used a wheelchair due to a chronic condition in his legs. This new ramp let him board the bus without the driver having to produce a cumbersome lift every time. Across the street, hidden behind the drawn blinds of a salmon-colored house, Paula Farnell sipped coffee. She stared at the bus stop with barely concealed disdain. Day after day, she had watched residents gather at that corner, the new ramp standing out as an unauthorized addition in her eyes. Paula had read the city notice about the temporary nature of the ramp. It was a pilot program to assess the community's needs. But in her mind, this ramp was an eyesore and a nuisance. She convinced herself it encouraged loitering and blocked the sidewalk. She drained the last bit of coffee, her lips pursed. Why should the entire neighborhood's aesthetic suffer for a few individuals who can't keep up? She thought. Already, a plan was forming in her mind. A plan that would eventually place Maplewood Glen at the center of citywide controversy, while exposing the depths of Paula's, Karen's, arrogance. Maplewood Glen's Homeowners Association was no trivial entity. It regulated nearly every aspect of the neighborhood, from the size of lawn ornaments to the permitted hues on garage doors. Historically, the HOA had been somewhat lenient, focusing on general tidiness and property values. Yet when Paula Farnell joined the board 3 years ago, she took on the unwritten role of enforcer with ferocious zeal. Paula was not the HOA president. She'd run for that position but narrowly lost to a more genial longtime resident named Bill Fletcher. Undeterred, Paula insisted on managing the Compliance and Aesthetics Committee, which oversaw alleged rule violations. Within a year, she had handed out citations for violations such as leaving Christmas lights up too long, placing a trash bin out on the curb an hour before the permissible time, and planting unapproved flora in front yards. The Maplewood Glen bus stop, ironically, wasn't even under the HOA's direct jurisdiction. It sat on the edge of a public sidewalk, managed by the city's transit department. Yet Paula, certain that anything near her neighborhood was subject to her interference, had begun complaining in HOA meetings about the temporary ramp. She argued it clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic or might cause a backlog of bus riders that spill onto private property. One evening, during a monthly HOA meeting in the community center, Paula made her grievances known. "We must ensure Maplewood Glen remains a place people aspire to live," she announced to the small gathering of neighbors who showed up. "Allowing unsightly, substandard structures, like that flimsy ramp, will diminish our neighborhood's value." Her eyes flicked toward Bill Fletcher, expecting quick agreement. Bill, however, responded mildly. "Paula, with all due respect, that ramp is city property. It's a pilot program to improve accessibility. I'm not convinced it's any business of ours. aside from ensuring it doesn't block driveways or create hazards? What about the environment it creates? Paula retorted. It's going to attract people who linger, possibly cause foot traffic issues. I've seen the bus stop crowd grow bigger. Soon we'll have litter, noise. We have an obligation to preserve the tranquility of Maplewood Glen. A few neighbors looked uncomfortable, sensing the discriminatory undertones. One woman, Darlene Cross, raised a hand. Actually, my father uses a wheelchair after his stroke, and that ramp has been a huge help when he visits me. I'd hate to see it removed. Paula's lips pinched. I'm not suggesting cruelty to the disabled, Darlene. She pressed her manicured fingers together. But we must be realistic about the overall impact on everyone's property values. The city didn't consult us, and I think we deserve a say. The meeting fizzled without resolution. Bill Fletcher simply promised to look into it, hoping the topic would lose steam. Paula left the building wearing a tight, triumphant smile. Unbeknownst to Bill, Paula already planned a more direct approach, one that would circumvent the board's ambivalence. As spring approached, the pilot ramp stayed in place. The city posted a small sign explaining it was testing new ways to aid mobility-impaired riders. Most Maplewood Glen residents hardly noticed it after a while. It was a small, gently sloping platform that bolted onto the curb. But Paula stewed over it daily. In her spare time, of which she had plenty, since she worked part-time from home, Paula obsessively researched city codes, hoping to find a loophole or violation that would justify the ramp's removal. When she found nothing conclusive, her frustration grew. She confided in a few like-minded neighbors, painting a dark picture of unwanted crowds and declining neighborhood standards. Some nodded in agreement, but many quietly thought she was overreacting. On an unassuming Wednesday afternoon, Paula decided to see for herself just how dangerous and disruptive the ramp was. She stepped outside in a tailored blouse and wedge sandals, marching toward the bus stop. At the time, Teresa Miles was waiting to board. She recognized Paula's approach, a sinking feeling forming in her stomach. Well, good afternoon, Miss Farnell, Teresa said politely, leaning on her cane. Paula eyed Teresa's cane, the ramp, then the bus schedule posted under the awning. Teresa, dear, she replied with a forced smile. Quite the apparatus the city's put up here, wouldn't you say? Teresa adjusted her grip on the cane. It's been a godsend for those of us who have difficulty climbing steps. I'm grateful they finally installed it. Paula murmured. She tapped the side of the ramp with her foot. But I do notice it's not very sturdy. And it juts out beyond the curb. People are bound to trip, or skateboards might come flying by. Teresa's polite smile wavered. I haven't seen any skaters out here. Besides, it's clearly marked, and it helps people board safely. Paula leaned in, dropping her voice. Teresa, as a neighbor, I'd hate to see you or anyone get hurt. This contraption seems precarious at best. Before Teresa could respond, the bus pulled up. The driver lowered the built-in platform that connected to the ramp, facilitating Teresa's entry. Paula pursed her lips disapprovingly at the process. She waved half-heartedly as Teresa limped on board. While the bus engine roared away, Paula stood there in the fading afternoon light, her arms crossed. She had just confirmed a suspicion. The ramp did allow physically impaired individuals to board more easily, but in Paula's twisted interpretation, that meant it caused the entire boarding process to slow down for the average commuter. In her mind, this compromise of speed and efficiency was intolerable. If no one else was willing to handle it, she would. The following weekend, a municipal staffer came by to inspect the temporary ramp and gather data for the pilot program. Paula, ever vigilant, spotted the official's arrival from her window. Eager for a confrontation, she grabbed her clipboard, brimming with printouts of HOA regulations and irrelevant city ordinances, and hurried outside. She intercepted the staffer, a young woman named Morgan Lau, who wore a bright yellow safety vest. Morgan was kneeling to check the bolts on the ramp when Paula strode up, posture rigid. Hello, Paula began, tone clipped. I'm Paula Farnell, member of the Maplewood Glen HOA Compliance Committee. May I ask what you're doing? Morgan adjusted her vest. Good afternoon. The city is conducting routine checks for the bus stop accessibility program. I'm verifying the ramp's stability and recording usage stats. Paula stiffened. I see. Well, I have concerns about this ramp's safety and how it affects our community. Are you aware that it extends nearly 2 feet into what might be considered private property? Morgan pulled out a small tape measure, stepping to the side. As far as we've mapped it, the public right-of-way includes this sidewalk and a margin beyond it. But let's see. She measured carefully, eyebrows knitting in concentration. It's actually within the public easement boundary. So it's city property, ma'am. Paula's lips tightened. Our property records say differently. Perhaps you should consult with the HOA board. She thrust her clipboard forward, though it mostly contained references to house paint rules and guidelines for fence heights. Morgan offered a polite but weary smile. I'll pass your concerns along, Miss Farnell. However, this ramp is part of a pilot authorized by the City Council. Unless there's a significant violation or safety issue, we plan to keep it until the trial period ends. Without waiting for Paula's response, Morgan jotted notes on her tablet and continued her inspection, ignoring Paula's mounting fury. When Morgan finished, she thanked Paula curtly and left, leaving the self-appointed enforcer fuming on the sidewalk. Paula's plan crystallized. The city was not going to remove the ramp on their own. The HOA, aside from her, seemed uninterested in an aggressive stance. If Paula wanted the ramp gone, she'd have to do it herself. In the days following Morgan Lau's visit, Paula's frustration grew into a gnawing obsession. Whenever she passed the bus stop, her gaze would fixate on the ramp, and she'd mutter about loitering, traffic bottlenecks, or unsightly structures. For her, it symbolized a larger battle, the failure of Maplewood Glen to maintain the flawless uniformity she idealized. Meanwhile, neighbors went about their routines, blissfully unaware that a storm was brewing. Teresa Miles continued to use the bus for her follow-up medical appointments, grateful she didn't have to risk climbing the bus steps without support. Jorge Lopez, who sometimes commuted downtown for part-time work, found it liberating not to rely on specialized paratransit services. He could just take the regular bus with ease. Talk of Paula's hostility occasionally surfaced at community get-togethers. Some neighbors joked about it. Better not plant that new shrub too close to the sidewalk. Paula might sight you. Others saw an uglier side. Her complaints about the ramp smacked of discrimination. Darlene Cross once confided in Bill Fletcher. Paula's making it personal, Bill. She's turned the ramp into an enemy. We can't let that stand. Bill gently assured her that the city, not Paula, had the final say. Paula, however, was not about to let city regulations override her personal crusade. She took pictures of the ramp at odd angles to exaggerate any slight protrusion. She emailed them to Bill Fletcher repeatedly, demanding urgent action. Bill, inundated with real estate closings and more pressing HOA business, told her politely that the ramp was city property, that their hands were tied. That only fueled Paula's defiance. If no one will stop this eyesore, she thought grimly, I will. Little did she know, her choice would send shockwaves through Maplewood Glen and beyond. One warm Friday in early summer, Maplewood Glen was quiet. The evening sky glowed purple, and crickets began their chorus as neighbors settled in for the night. Paula Farnell peeked out her window, heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nerves. A black duffel bag lay on her sofa, containing a wrench set, a small pry bar, and other tools. She had spent the past week researching how to remove metal bolts from concrete. This is for the good of the community, Paula reassured herself. They'll thank me once it's gone. Wearing dark jeans and a plain jacket, Paula slipped out of her house, duffel bag in hand. She chose her timing carefully. After 10 p.m., when bus service slowed and foot traffic was minimal, clouds drifted over the moon, casting shifting shadows across the sidewalk. Paula's heart thudded as she approached the ramp, her footsteps echoing. The ramp was bolted at 4 points to the curb and sidewalk. Kneeling on the cool concrete, Paula rummaged in the bag for a sturdy wrench. She tested one of the bolts, rust-resistant, not easily undone. Sucking in a sharp breath, she tried again with more force. A screech tore the silence. She froze, glancing around to ensure no one heard. She loosened the first bolt, then moved on, a bead of sweat forming on her brow. 2 down, 2 to go. Paula grimaced in effort, cursing softly under her breath. The last bolt proved especially stubborn, requiring her to use the pry bar. Finally, with an awful clang, the metal ramp's corner lifted from the curb. Her muscles trembled with the exertion of hauling the ramp's edge free from its anchor. Adrenaline soared as she wrestled the ramp off the sidewalk. She dragged it a few feet behind the bus stop, out of immediate sight. The ramp was heavier than she expected, but she managed to tip it on its side, revealing chipped paint where she'd forced the pry bar in. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Paula's eyes widened, her pulse racing. She shoved her tools back into the duffel, stepping away from the bus stop as quickly as she could without breaking into a full run. Her breath came in heaving gasps by the time she reached her front porch. Despite her shaking hands, Paula felt a twisted sense of triumph. The ramp was dislodged. Maybe the city would conclude it was damaged, or that the pilot program was impractical. All that matters, Paula told herself, is that it's gone, and Maplewood Glen won't be burdened by it any longer. She had no idea that a pair of eyes had watched her from a second-story window across the street. The next morning dawned bright and unseasonably warm. By 7 a.m., some neighbors were out walking dogs or jogging. Others ventured to the bus stop for weekend errands. Among them was Teresa Miles, cane in hand. She approached slowly, noticing something felt off. Where the gentle ramp once sloped, she found only raw bolts protruding from the concrete. Some snapped entirely. The ramp itself was missing, aside from a twisted corner lying haphazardly behind the bench. A rush of panic hit Teresa. "Oh no," she murmured aloud. With her bad knee, navigating the bus steps without that ramp was risky. She scoured the area, baffled. Who would do such a thing? Behind her, Jorge Lopez wheeled up in his chair, mouth dropping open in shock. "Teresa, what happened to the ramp?" She shook her head, feeling sudden tears prick her eyes. "I don't know. It was here yesterday evening." Jorge's chest tightened. Without the ramp, he couldn't board a standard bus independently. His frustration flared. They had no official paratransit scheduled that day. He'd planned to catch the regular bus downtown for a medical supply run. Now, that might be impossible. "We need to call someone," he said, voice wavering. "This has to be vandalism." A small crowd gathered as other neighbors approached. Some snapped photos on their phones. Kevin Drake, a technology consultant who lived nearby, searched the city's transit website for a contact number. "I'll file a complaint right away," he said, furious. "I can't believe someone would stoop this low." Meanwhile, perched on her porch, Paula Farnell feigned ignorance. She sipped her morning coffee, sunglasses hiding her expression. She heard faint exclamations from the bus stop. Something akin to triumph flickered in her heart. Now they'll see how pointless that ramp was, she thought. But she hadn't counted on the shock and anger that would ripple through Maplewood Glen. As the hours passed, social media posts emerged, condemning the vandalism. People began to ask who did it. Rumors spread. Some suspected local teenagers, others guessed a random vandal. A few eyed Paula's house suspiciously, mindful of her outspoken dislike. By late afternoon, a city transit official arrived to survey the damage. Paula stayed inside, watching from behind her curtains, a slow dread creeping in. She wasn't expecting how swiftly people would mobilize to demand accountability. Perhaps she thought no one would care enough to raise a fuss. But Maplewood Glen's residents, especially those affected by disabilities, were not letting this slide. Unbeknownst to Paula, her late-night vandalism had not gone entirely unwitnessed. Mary Ann Bowers, a night shift nurse, lived in the two-story home directly across from the bus stop. That night, she had trouble sleeping and spent time by her bedroom window, hoping a cool breeze would help her doze off. Instead, she spotted a crouched figure wrestling with the ramp around 10:30 p.m. Alarmed, she grabbed her phone. The image quality was grainy in the dim light, but Mary Ann captured enough footage to reveal a petite, middle-aged woman in dark clothing using tools to remove the ramp. The figure's face wasn't visible in full. Still, the posture, the build, and a momentary glimpse of short, layered hair left Mary Ann with a strong suspicion that might be Paula Farnell. No one else in Maplewood Glen carried themselves quite like that. At first, Mary Ann hesitated to come forward. She dreaded drama and confrontation. But when she saw the heartbreak on Teresa Miles's face, the anger from Jorge Lopez, she knew doing nothing wasn't an option. After checking with her husband, she decided to share the footage. The following day, she emailed a copy to the City Transit Department and called Bill Fletcher, the HOA president. That evening, Bill Fletcher arrived at Mary Ann's doorstep, concern etched across his features. "Mary Ann, can we talk about your video?" "The city's requesting more details," he said quietly. She invited him in, and together they reviewed the clip on her laptop. Though somewhat blurry, it clearly showed a slender figure prying out bolts. As the unknown vandal turned, the porch light from a neighboring house briefly illuminated her face. Bill paused the video. He pressed his lips together. That sure looks like Paula, he muttered. I can't be 100% certain, but the resemblance is strong. Marianne swallowed. I thought so too. Her hair, her build, the shape of her face even for just a second. I don't want to accuse someone unfairly, but this is bigger than some petty complaint. People need that ramp. Bill nodded heavily. I understand. Let's proceed carefully. The city might conduct its own investigation, but if Paula is the culprit, we have a real problem on our hands. A wave of guilt washed over Marianne, though she wasn't the one at fault. She had never wanted to publicly accuse a neighbor. But seeing Teresa forced to skip her bus trip and Jorge's wheelchair stuck on the sidewalk convinced her she did the right thing. The truth was unraveling, and soon enough, Maplewood Glen would learn exactly who was responsible. Word traveled fast in the small suburb. By the next afternoon, most residents had heard whispers that Marianne Bowers possessed incriminating footage. Paula sensed the shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Neighbors offered cold stares or, worse, openly confronted her about the ramp's removal. She feigned shock each time, expressing outrage that someone would vandalize public property. Late that day, Bill Fletcher called an emergency meeting at the community center. The usual group of 15 or so neighbors swelled to nearly 40, crowding the room. Paula arrived in her typical semi-professional attire, lips set in a tight line. Bill stood at the front, a laptop open. Thank you for coming, he began. As many of you know, the accessibility ramp at our bus stop was vandalized. The city's investigating. We have video evidence from a neighbor's security camera. He gestured to the laptop, though he refrained from playing it publicly just yet. All eyes landed on Paula, who crossed her arms defensively. Her gaze darted around the room. She cleared her throat. We need to be certain we aren't jumping to conclusions. Anyone could have done it. Murmurs rippled through the attendees. Darlene Cross spoke up. Paula, you've been complaining about that ramp for weeks. You said it was an eyesore. Now it's suddenly gone. Paula raised her chin. Yes, I expressed concerns, valid ones, about property values and safety. But to accuse me of vandalizing it is slanderous. I'd never break the law, Darlene. Kevin Drake shook his head. You expect us to believe that, given your history of trying to micromanage every inch of this neighborhood? Bill Fletcher cleared his throat. Let's keep this civil. The city is handling the official investigation. I've been asked to share the footage with them. At this point, it's fairly compelling, though not perfectly conclusive. The police will likely follow up. Paula's face paled. She forced a haughty smirk. Well, I'm sure they'll see there's no proof it's me. I was home all night. I mean, I was reading a book. Her voice faltered slightly. Across the room, Jorge Lopez quietly glared at Paula, frustration evident in his set jaw. Teresa Miles sat next to him, her cane leaning against her seat, eyes filled with hurt. They wanted justice, not a pointless argument. Bill recognized the tension. For now, I suggest we give the city time to reinstall or replace the ramp. As for the vandal, they'll face consequences when the investigation concludes. People began filing out. Paula lingered a moment, arms still crossed. She locked eyes with Bill. You can't pin this on me. I've done nothing wrong. Bill exhaled. I'm not pinning anything on anyone, Paula. But I have to say, if that's you on the video, it's going to come out. And the community won't stand for it. Paula held his gaze for a long beat, then pivoted on her heel and marched away. Fear and anger churned in her gut. Despite her denials, deep down she knew that the fuzzy recording might be enough to ruin her carefully cultivated reputation. And if Maplewood Glen turned against her, she would lose the influence she so fiercely guarded. Within the week, the Maplewood Glen bus stop became a local media curiosity. A brief article ran in the city newspaper's online edition with the headline, Accessibility Ramp Vandalized. Did a community member go too far? The piece mentioned that the city's transit department was collaborating with law enforcement to identify the culprit. Neighbors took photos of the bus stop's damaged remains, sharing them on social media with outraged captions. Comments flooded in, condemning the act. Several disability advocacy groups joined the discussion, highlighting the importance of inclusive infrastructure. Maplewood Glen, once known for its neatly trimmed lawns, became the symbol of a petty sabotage that hurt disabled residents most. One Tuesday morning, two city transit officials, Morgan Lau among them, arrived in a city truck with a replacement ramp. This time, they brought more robust hardware, planning to secure it with additional anchors. They also carried an official notice from the mayor's office, reaffirming the city's right to maintain accessible bus stops. A few local news reporters hovered, snapping photos. Paula watched from her window, anxiety rising. This was the opposite of what she'd hoped for. Instead of the ramp disappearing quietly, it was being reinstalled with greater fanfare. And the culprit was sure to be exposed in due time. Outside, Morgan Lau looked over the site, shaking her head at the vandalism. She turned to Bill Fletcher, who was present to represent the HOA in an official capacity. "We're installing a slightly different model," Morgan explained. "It has more robust steel brackets, harder to remove, or, at least, it won't be so simple to unbolt." Bill nodded wearily, glancing at the growing crowd of curious neighbors. "We appreciate it. Many folks here rely on this ramp." The city workers got to it, drilling fresh holes, placing longer anchors, and leveling the new metal structure so wheelchairs or walkers could roll up smoothly. Once finished, they taped up a sign, "Ramp installed by City of Hillcrest. Do not tamper. Violators subject to criminal prosecution." A ripple of satisfaction spread among the onlookers. Teresa Miles clapped softly, relief evident in her eyes. Jorge Lopez, determined to test it, rolled his wheelchair up the ramp. The gentle incline offered no resistance. He smiled broadly, despite the frustration he'd endured. Reporters interviewed them on the spot, capturing every angle for the evening news. Paula's house loomed in the background, blinds drawn. Though her neighbors didn't see her, she stood behind those blinds, seething. The city had not only replaced the ramp but fortified it. All because of me, the thought twisted her stomach. She'd inadvertently ensured that nothing short of major demolition would remove the structure now. The official city investigation continued. Police reviewed Marion Bowers' footage, comparing it to Paula's known physical characteristics. They interviewed several neighbors. Paula steadfastly denied involvement, clinging to alibis no one could corroborate. Nonetheless, the evidence mounted. One rainy afternoon, Bill Fletcher received a call from a city detective, informing him that charges might soon be filed against the suspect. Bill sighed, silently lamenting the drama overshadowing Maplewood Glen. He didn't relish the idea of a neighbor facing legal consequences, but the act harmed vulnerable residents, and it couldn't be ignored. Sensing her predicament, Paula confronted Bill in the parking lot outside the community center. Raindrops streaked her windbreaker as she hurried up to him. "Bill," she began, voice wavering between anger and desperation, "this is going too far. You know me. I wouldn't do anything criminal." Bill studied her face. "I thought I knew you, Paula. But the video evidence, it's compelling." Paula swallowed. "It's not me. The angle, the lighting, it's impossible to be sure." He paused, voice lowering. "Maybe so, but your constant complaints about that ramp, your knowledge of how to unbolt things. Look, I don't want to see you dragged through court, but everything points your way." She bristled, eyes flashing. "So you're saying I should just confess to something I didn't do?" Bill frowned. He felt torn between compassion for a neighbor and anger at the cruel act committed. "I'm saying the truth will come out. If it really wasn't you, then you have nothing to fear from an investigation. But if you did it," he stopped, reading the tension in her posture, "then you need to face the consequences." For a moment, Paula looked like she might lash out. Instead, she burst into tears, a shocking display from someone typically so controlled. "I didn't mean to. I never intended for it to go this far. I thought it was an eyesore. I was trying to protect the neighborhood." Her words stumbled out in fits and starts, half a confession, half a justification. Bill's shoulders sagged. "Why, Paula? People need that ramp. You saw how much it hurt them when it was gone." Trembling, Paula wiped rain and tears from her cheeks. "I was thinking about property values, about how these sorts of additions signal a downward trend. I read so many articles about how unregulated structures can degrade a neighborhood's aesthetics. I didn't realize, or maybe I refused to realize, how much certain people relied on it." In that raw moment, Bill felt pity, but also anger. "I'm sorry, Paula. This is bigger than you or me now. It's a crime under city law to tamper with public property. If the detective finds enough evidence, you'll be charged." Paula hung her head. She understood the gravity of her actions, though it came too late. She turned on her heel and hurried away, raindrops splashing around her. Bill watched her retreating figure with a heavy heart. The storm that had begun as a private crusade was now a public scandal, and Paula Farnell, or Karen as her critics called her, stood at its center. Maplewood Glen reeled from the ongoing investigation and the local media attention. Neighbors who once politely greeted Paula now avoided her or offered frosty stares. Children whispered rumors about the ramp wrecker. The small grocery store in town was abuzz with talk every time someone from the neighborhood appeared, with folks pointing and speculating. Paula tried to maintain her daily routine, walking her terrier, tidying her yard, but an unspoken gulf isolated her. She had effectively alienated the community. Worst of all, she'd harmed the people who needed the ramp most. Teresa Miles and Jorge Lopez no longer responded to her forced hellos. Indeed, they'd be well within their rights to press charges themselves, and Paula half expected it. The Maplewood Glen HOA board, which usually steered clear of personal disputes, found itself pressured to act. Several residents demanded Paula's removal from any position of authority. Bill Fletcher announced an emergency board meeting to decide whether Paula should be stripped of her role on the Compliance and Aesthetics Committee. The notion of innocent until proven guilty clashed with the video evidence, her partial confession to Bill, and the public outcry. On a late Tuesday afternoon, Paula received a letter hand-delivered by Darlene Cross, who now served as an interim board secretary. The letter informed Paula that the HOA, separate from the city's legal process, would hold a vote regarding her immediate suspension from board duties. If the vote passed, she'd lose all standing and privileges within the HOA. Reading the letter at her kitchen table, Paula's hand shook. This wasn't just about the ramp anymore. It was about her entire identity, the power she believed was hers, the respect she thought she'd earned. She realized, with a sick twist of regret, that her sabotage might cost her everything. But it's all so unfair, she rationalized in a final act of denial. I just tried to protect Maplewood Glen from a slippery slope. Yet even she knew that argument rang hollow. No one wanted to hear about property values at the expense of disabled residents' dignity. No one wanted to see a neighbor so blinded by petty rules that she'd commit vandalism. Paula set the letter aside, tears stinging her eyes again. She had run out of justifications. While Paula's world collapsed, Maplewood Glen experienced an unexpected surge of unity. Fueled by empathy for disabled neighbors, a group of residents organized a small fundraiser to support local disability advocacy. They sold homemade baked goods, crafts, and even arranged a mini yard sale, donating proceeds to a city nonprofit that helped people with mobility challenges. Teresa Miles, cane in hand, helped staff the bake sale table. She couldn't stand for long periods, but she smiled warmly at each visitor. The injustice she experienced lit a spark in her, one that pushed her to turn a negative event into something positive. Jorge Lopez, too, joined in, collecting donated wheelchairs and walkers to refurbish and give to those in need. Children scrawled supportive messages in chalk near the bus stop. Accessibility matters, and ramps equals freedom. A few teenagers painted colorful signs that read, "This ramp stays," taped onto the newly fortified steel structure. Each day, as the bus rolled up, passengers paused to note the transformation, both the physical ramp and the intangible sense of solidarity. Local news outlets picked up the story of Maplewood Glen's philanthropic efforts. This overshadowed the earlier negative headlines about vandalism. While the suspect, unofficially identified as Paula Farnell, was under investigation, the neighborhood's collective spirit took center stage. Interviews with Teresa and Jorge touched viewers' hearts, shining a compassionate light on what inclusive design meant for everyday life. Paula, ironically, had caused the very solidarity she once feared, people from different backgrounds rallying around a ramp that she deemed an eyesore. Day after day, she watched from her lonely vantage point, forced to see how her act of sabotage had led to not just a stronger ramp, but a renewed sense of fellowship in Maplewood Glen. After weeks of mounting tension, the day arrived when the HOA board would vote on Paula Farnell's status. By then, the city detective had informed Bill Fletcher that the police intended to charge Paula with misdemeanor vandalism of public property. Her partial admission to Bill, combined with Marianne's video, made the case strong. The detective indicated that an arrest was likely imminent or that Paula could surrender voluntarily to face the charge. The HOA meeting took place in the usual community center hall. Every seat was filled. Some residents stood along the walls. Bill Fletcher, flanked by the other 4 board members, called the meeting to order. Paula had considered not attending, but a stubborn pride pushed her to appear. She sat in a chair near the front, eyes downcast. She knew she faced an almost certain public rebuke. Bill began, voice steady. "We're here to address a single agenda item, whether Ms. Paula Farnell should be suspended from all HOA duties, effective immediately, pending the resolution of criminal charges related to vandalizing the city's accessibility ramp." A hush fell. Bill continued, "This board does not presume guilt. However, the evidence is substantial, and her role as a compliance officer is incompatible with such allegations." He opened the floor for comments. Several residents stood to speak. Teresa Miles rose slowly, leaning on her cane. "I never wanted vengeance," she said softly. "But if Ms. Farnell is responsible, she hurt people who rely on that ramp. We have to stand up for what's right." Jorge Lopez, in his wheelchair, added, "Community means helping everyone thrive. Removing that ramp was cruel. I support her removal from HOA duties because I don't trust her judgment anymore." Others voiced anger, disappointment, or heartbreak. A few individuals who previously sided with Paula wavered, acknowledging the damage done. The moral consensus was clear. Paula's act of sabotage could not be condoned. Paula sat rigid, tears glistening. She opened her mouth once to speak, but words wouldn't come. She recognized that any protest would ring hollow. When the board called for a vote, the result was unanimous. Paula Farnell was stripped of her title and responsibilities. Effective immediately, she could no longer enforce HOA rules, serve on committees, or represent Maplewood Glen in any official capacity. No applause followed. This was not a triumphant moment, but a solemn acknowledgement that a line had been crossed. Paula rose on shaky legs and left the room, a stunned silence following her. Outside, clouds gathered in the evening sky, mirroring the turmoil in her heart. In the days that followed, Paula Farnell turned herself in at the local police station, accompanied by her lawyer. She was booked on misdemeanor charges and released pending trial. Many suspected she would eventually plead guilty to avoid a drawn-out court case. Regardless of the final legal outcome, Maplewood Glen collectively closed the chapter on her antagonistic reign within the HOA. Meanwhile, the upgraded steel ramp remained firmly bolted at the bus stop. With each passing day, more wheelchair users, elderly residents with walkers, parents pushing strollers, and everyday commuters benefited from the easier access. The bus line, noticing an increase in ridership, praised Maplewood Glen for its support of inclusive design. City officials lauded the neighborhood's swift response in organizing fundraising and awareness efforts. No one had to guess whether Paula would again tamper with the ramp. It was secured with industrial-grade fastenings and monitored by a new security camera perched on the nearby lamp post. The city, determined to prevent future sabotage, took every precaution. In a twist of irony, Paula's brazen deed paved the way for an even more permanent, robust installation. Maplewood Glen emerged from the turmoil a closer-knit community. Neighbors learned to look out for each other, to stand up for what was right, and to appreciate the ways small acts of inclusion can profoundly impact people's lives. Teresa Miles fully recovered from knee surgery, though she continued to advocate for accessible infrastructure. Jorge Lopez became a spokesperson for a local nonprofit, often referencing Maplewood Glen's ramp as a success story. As for Paula Farnell, Karen, she retreated into quiet obscurity. She kept to herself, seldom interacting with neighbors. When passers-by saw her in the yard, they exchanged uncomfortable nods at best. Over time, a few neighbors managed small courtesies, a wave hello, a reluctant smile. But the trust was gone. Paula had lost her position, her influence, and her veneer of moral authority. Still, Maplewood Glen's bus stop stood as a testament to a lesson learned. That community cannot flourish by excluding its most vulnerable members. Accessibility was not a nuisance. It was a cornerstone of neighborly compassion. And in the swirl of tension and heartbreak that had led to a stronger ramp, the neighborhood discovered an unbreakable unity more enduring than any bolt or bracket.